Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and my thanks to the organisers for the kind invitation to come and help celebrate this anniversary. I haven't actually been in the practice of celebrating every 10 years, but I have 2 or 3 occasions before being at ICSE at such meetings. So, I'm going to talk about something which was back in 1968. A lot of you will not know quite how tumultuous a year 1968 was with respect to the world. I'm not talking just computing. That was the year when Warsaw, Poland, was invaded by 5 of the Warsaw Pact countries. It was the year when both Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy were assassinated. I was living in the States at the time and remember being driven through Manhattan on the evening of that second assassination by an absolutely scared taxi driver, past groups of police at every main intersection. It was really quite something. That was burnt. Still is burnt into my memory. It was the time of lots of anti-Vietnam War protests and of student protests in Europe, particularly in Paris, but not only in Paris. And all of that was happening in 1968. So politically, that positions the time view. But enough about that sort of politics. Let me switch to talking about the Nato Conference. This was a sponsored conference on software engineering held in Garmisch-Partenkirchen, a place which should have been a previous site of the Winter Olympics in Bavaria, near the Alps. Absolutely glorious place. And that is the one photograph that I had of the hotel afterwards. So, as has just been mentioned, on several of the anniversaries, I've been invited to reminisce and to comment, perhaps naively, on the then, present, and the future. This is rather awkward. I didn't want to. It's very bad to be asked to reminisce several times, because you start talking not about your memories, but your memories of your memories, and your memories of your memories of your memories, if you see what I mean. So a very simple way of avoiding that is that I'm going to use a few, 2 or 3 slides, which I did use much earlier. So those that are as accurate now as they were then, they're at least not more inaccurate. I was invited to speak at ICSE in 1979, the 10th anniversary of the second of the NATO conferences. And that was, in fact, the first time I had spoken or done anything whatsoever to do with software engineering after the Rome Conference, where I was so appalled by the Rome Conference that I took a vow to have nothing whatsoever to do with software engineering. And I stuck to that vow until 1979. Why did I do that? Because in 1968, the Conference on Software Engineering was very clear that the term software engineering was expressing a need, not expressing a reality. 1 year later, a number, particularly of the academics at the second conference, automatically assumed that what they were doing now merited the term software engineering. And it was so manifestly obvious to me that they didn't. And the conference, in many other ways, was a very disappointing effect, a disappointing affair, that I decided to have nothing to do with it. But at ICSE 1979, there were 4 keynote talks, 2 at the beginning and 2 at the end. I was invited to talk about software engineering as it was, Barry Baim, who is here at the conference, I think I saw him here in the hall now, to talk about software engineering as it is. Edgar Dijkstra, the late Edgar Dijkstra, on software engineering as it should be, and the late Vlad Tursky on software engineering as it will be. A fourth talk, which was essentially an antidote to the third talk. The next few slides are largely from my 1979 talk. Some of you in the hall will not need reminding what computing was like in the 1960s. But I would guess a lot of you can have very little idea as to how different things were. Computers were very big. A computer was something that you could walk into sometimes. And very often that was what the engineers had to do. They were the sort of thing that cost millions of pounds or dollars and were bought by large organizations, governments and the like in the main. Just the first of the mini computers were starting to appear, and those were being used in very well-funded laboratories. The idea of the personal computer had not arrived. There's a long, long list of things that had not arrived. Databases, networks, distributed systems, those had not been invited yet. Local area networks were not known. Long-distance networking, the beginning of the ARPANET, that had started, but that was it. The term software was being used. The term software engineering was not being used. When years ago I looked back, I did manage to find a very few written references to software engineering predating 1968. But in general, software was something, or system software was something that was provided free free in the sense of already paid for, free with hardware. And application software were normally designed especially for particular environments and computers. The notion of software as a commodity, that did not exist. So, as I said, system software was usually provided free. When you moved to a new computer, basically you typically had to start all over again and rewrite or redesign the software that you were using. Seems a crazy idea now, but that's what it was like then. Many organizations, particularly large organizations, were finding themselves becoming increasingly dependent on computer systems and software systems. On the other hand, and this was something that came out very much during the '68 conference, a lot of these very large projects were far from successful. The phrase underestimates and over expectations is from the title of a paper by John Licklider, surveying, I think, about 20 or 30 huge American, mainly military, command and control systems and the like. Not one of which had met its budget or its timetable. Quite a lot of which, and in fact, not even managed to become operational. So that was part of the background. It was only the next year when IBM unbundled its software. That was not a voluntary act, I should point out. When IBM unbundled its software, then software started to become a commodity. The Nato conference was planned, as far as I remember, by Fritz Bauer, Professor Bauer of Munich, and Professor Bollier of Grenoble, and I've suddenly gone blank on the name of the Scandinavian third professor. I and Peter Nauer were invited to edit a report that would come from this, but I do not recall having any input into the organization of the conference or the selection of the attendees. But the selection of the attendees, I think, was done very, very well, because it brought together a whole set of people from academic research, industrial research, and industry, from a great variety of countries, an awful lot of whom knew only a few other people at the conference beforehand. And that, I think, was a major factor in the impact and in the success of the conference. Many of the participants afterwards were saying that it had changed their future research plans. I read some years later that when Al Perlis received the copies of the report of the conference, he walked down into the Carnegie Mellon Computer Science postgraduate research room with a great bundle of these blue reports, and handed them out to all the students saying, "Read this, it'll change your lives." I was very pleased to read that many years later. It's one of the most flattering things I've ever seen. Peter Nauer and I should explain, the whole idea of the conference from the beginning was that it should produce a report. And quite a bit of the discussion at the conference was on the structure of the intended structure of the report. So in the following week in Munich, Peter Nauer and I, with some helpers, had the task of fleshing out the report. And doing so using the tapes of the discussions and the various position papers that had been written before and at the conference. I was absolutely delighted when Doug McElroy, one of my colleagues down the front there, described our report as a triumph of misapplied quotation. I have treasured that remark ever since. The '69 conference, I think I've said some of this already, was one in which there was a lot of acrimony. It was in a much less attractive, Rome is attractive. The hotel chosen was far from attractive. The discussion sessions opened up gaps rather than formed good relationships. Tom Simpson of IBM, the designer of one of the very early sort of proto-operating systems, produced a wonderful one-page account. Well, it was he gave a presentation which, when written down, took a page. On masterpiece engineering. He claimed that the previous night he'd been walking in the hotel garden and had fallen over a stone, and read on the stone that said, "Here in 1568, a group of artists and sculptors and other masterpiece makers were debating the problems of their profession, the low productivity and the like." Go and read that one page. It's great. I'll make just one quote from it, I believe, on the next slide. Here we are. Regrettably, none of these advances in knowledge seem to have any impact on masterpiece production, and so at length the group decided that the basic difficulty was clearly a management problem. One of the brighter students, by the name of L. Da Vinci, was instantly promoted to manager of the project, putting him in charge of procuring paints, canvases, and brushes for the rest of the organization. That talk, that impromptu talk, killed stone dead a hidden agenda that not I, but other people had on this second conference, which was to convince, to con NATO into setting up an Institute of Software Engineering. That there were some discussions on that up to the masterpiece engineering talk, but thereafter the idea was dead, stone dead. So you can find the two reports on the web. You can find the masterpiece engineering on the web, and also a great number of photographs, most of them by Bob McClure, and Bob McClure is here as well today. I'm pleased to say. Jumping forward quite a time to just 10 years ago, I was invited to give a talk, reminiscences and my views of the subject. And one of the main comments that I made then is one I'd like to repeat now, which was to point out that though there are many types of industry, of software industry now at the moment, there is a software industry which has grown up. It took quite a while for it to come into existence. Almost certainly the most important event which caused it to come into existence was the personal computer. Then you started having a software package industry, and software, instead of being something which was like bespoke tailoring, was an off-the-peg situation. And Darwinian evolution, survival of the fittest started to happen, affected a bit by lawyers and commerce and so on. But all of a sudden, it seemed to me that all sorts of incredibly wonderful software was generated through this process of competition and, as I say, survival of the fittest and evolution. And that is a totally different sort of situation that existed in 1968. And it is something that I think we do well to remember and think in terms of how that sort of software, that sort of environment changes things. Instead of giving you my opinions, let me talk in terms of a couple of experts. A colleague of mine, Ian Somerville's book, Software Engineering, now in its 10th edition, is an absolutely massive compilation of all of the software techniques and the likes. And Ian argues the subject really needs to be treated as covering a whole range of different sub-disciplines. His definition of software engineering is one I want to quote, that it's an engineering discipline that's concerned with all aspects of software production from the early stages of system specification through to maintaining the system after it's gone into use. Dave Parnas was quoted earlier today. He gives a much more critical view of software engineering, at least he did a few years ago. He suggests that the most accurate term for most people who are called software engineers would be paid software designers. He's not willing to use the accolade engineers to describe most of those people, saying that even the professional engineers amongst that group almost certainly have got their professional engineering qualification in something other than software. Well, I'm leaving you to read that rather typically Parnas quotation, suggesting that only when agreement has been reached on the core body of knowledge that is required of somebody to be a software engineer, and there is a licensing scheme that ensures that the licensees have that knowledge, will we have people who are worthy of the term, who deserve the term professional software engineer. In English, the word engineering is used in a couple of senses, and I fear that the most important sense sometimes is the cynical one. To engineer something is to have a devious way of doing something. If I'm an engineer at all, it's of that type, I'm afraid. So, how does software engineering differ from programming? To my great surprise, Dave Parnas credits me with what he regards as the best definition of that distinction. He credits me with the phrase, the multi-person development of multi-version programs. That's the sort of thing that software engineers do as opposed to mere programmers. The only problem is I can't justify his claim. I can't remember having said that, and I can't find anywhere where I've written it down. Mind you, I hope he's right, because I like the phrase, and I'm happy to try and take the credit. What I find a little strange, though, is neither Ian Somerville nor Dave Parnas make the distinction that I think is really rather critical between off-the-peg software and bespoke software. Between the sort of large software which is produced for one particular environment, for one particular client, sometimes absolutely de novo, with some terrible and terribly difficult and complex requirement that has to be satisfied first time in case something awful happens. That's the sort of notion I have of bespoke software, as opposed to the off-the-peg software, which often evolves into respectability. There is a certain large software company that's famous for producing systems where only the third one of a particular line is likely to be at all satisfactory. But by the time you've gone through that, you start having really very good software. The sort of systems of concern in 1968 were all bespoke systems. And they were all, as far as I could see, related to, they violated the rule that I quoted at the bottom there from a wonderful book called Systemantics. It's an apparently humorous book, which the more you read it, the more you realize it isn't funny at all. And the line at the bottom there, a complex system that works is invariably found to have evolved from a simple system that worked. That's something very much people forget at their peril. We still have large bespoke systems, so I'm afraid we still have lots of the problems, or the modern equivalent of the problems that we had in 1968. There's one particular large bespoke system that I know a fair bit about, and I've just got a couple of slides about that. And that's the system that the UK National Health Service was trying to acquire, called NPFIT, National Programme for Information Technology. It was claimed in 2005 to be the world's biggest civil IT project. That already sounds to me to be an incredibly dangerous boast, and it was. This was intended to provide an online service for use by 40,000 GPs, doctors, 80,000 other doctors in hospitals and the like, 350,000 nurses. You can go on reading the numbers. A large online system for satisfying that lot of people in all sorts of sub-applications based on computerized clinical records and the like. I was involved in a major public campaign to get this project evaluated before any more millions of pounds were spent on it. I and a group of 22 other professors of computing science wrote a letter to the London Times, which created quite a stir. We created a 400-page dossier of concerns about this system. I testified to a parliamentary committee in exactly the same sort of environment, the same sort of room that all sorts of people have been testifying recently from Cambridge Analytica and the like, exactly the room that Mark Zuckerberg refused to come to. And I testified about that system's huge size and its complexity, its over-centralized approach to system specification and acquisition, and its the extremely demanding dependability and security requirements. The Public Accounts Committee, another parliamentary committee, probably the most powerful one, later described the project as the worst and most expensive contracting fiasco in the public sector history. It was abandoned in 2011, having cost £20 billion. I guess you might say that was one of my bigger I told you so's. On the left there is the front cover of our dossier. That's still available online. On the right there, they're the sort of things that are in the dossier. There were lots of stories in the press about how things were going wrong. There were a number of parliamentary reports, like that one on the electronic patient record. There were a lot of professional scientific papers and the like. And we've got quotes from all of those in this 400-page document. So that is the one comment I'd like to make about bespoke systems and their dangers. Just briefly on standards in software. This was another issue I raised at ComSac, and what I felt was that there were a ridiculous number of different software languages and software developments. 10 years ago, the History of Programming Languages roster or register of programming of languages listed 8,512 languages. Now it's 8,945. I think that means it's slowing down a bit, but it's still something that I find very difficult to justify. You could say that our field has grown greatly. One can question whether it has matured. So, let me bring this diatribe to an end. I started my talk in 1979 with quoting the great Cambridge historian Geoffrey Elton. The future is dark, the present burdensome. Only the past, dead and finished, bears contemplation. Those who look upon it have survived it. They are its product and its victors. No wonder, therefore, that men, sorry, he missed out women, that men and women concern themselves with history. Another favorite quotation of mine has been given already a couple of times this morning, though I will now quote it correctly. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it, by George Santayana. I hope you'll forgive me for having chosen to concentrate mainly on matters historical and to avoid just spending half an hour here stroking you and telling you what a wonderful subject you are pursuing and how well you are doing. And let me hurriedly say that a lot of great work is done. What I'm questioning is how far we are from having something that is worthy of being called an engineering and discipline. So I urge you to take some time to read or reread the first, don't bother with the second, the first of the NATO reports, and also the papers by Barry Baim, Vlad Tursky, and Edgar Dijkstra that they wrote back in 1979. Before you resume your work inventing yet another language and yet another technique. Thank you.